Hello and welcome to Herding Code. This episode is being recorded May 16, 2022. Today I'm talking to David Ortinau about .NET MAUI. Welcome,
Hey,
David.
John. Hey, good to see you.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What the heck is .NET MAUI? I know there's kind of this Xamarin thing out there, and there's been
Yeah.
Xamarin Forms, and now there's .NET MAUI. What is it?
So .NET MAUI, it stands for Multi-Platform App UI. And it is really the evolution of Xamarin. So Xamarin is started, like 10, 12 years ago, mono framework, mono touch, mono droid. And it was essentially saying, hey, let's take what Apple and Google are doing, these mobile platforms that are super cool, and let's bring it to .NET developers. And it was an open source thing. At least as far as the runtime and things like that go. But it was kind of out there in the community. And then, 6 years ago, Microsoft acquired it. And then 5 years ago, I joined Microsoft to be the program manager for Xamarin Forms, specifically the cross-platform layer. That we favor XAML, but you can totally just use C# or F# actually to write your mobile applications. But it was a very mobile-focused thing, right? So what we have been doing in the .NET space over years is unifying, taking all these things that were disparate. They all had different roots in terms of where they started, but .NET developers, we want to be able to build anything with .NET and be able to reuse not only the technology but our skills. .NET Framework turned into .NET Core, .NET 5 shipped. And .NET 5 unified some of the mono pieces and some of the BCL pieces, BCL standing for Base Class Library. And then we had grandiose plans that was when Xamarin would also become really a core part of .NET. However, pandemic things, best laid plans of mice and men, things didn't quite go the way we wanted.
Well, also, plus it's a big job, right? I mean, uniting everything, and you've had like .NET and C# are like they're similar specifications, but like the whole way that Mono and Xamarin worked always seemed like it was amazing to me that it actually worked, right?
Yeah, it was the ingenuity of some very smart people that made it work. But, especially as it grew outside of Microsoft's doors, really even before everything was mostly open sourced, there was a lot of duct taping to make things work and to make it a good developer experience. So we're now able to, in the open source era and as part of Microsoft, kind of rectify some of those things. So, we're adopting SDK style projects, the same project system that the rest of .NET uses. And we've also added platforms. So now we give first place support to Windows and Mac desktops. So that's a big addition that Xamarin didn't really have. I mean, we kind of had UWP, but that really started because we had this Windows Phone thing. And I don't want to like trigger anybody, but it was pretty cool.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. Tons of stuff that has needed to happen under the hood, from the runtime, the base class library, unifying all the APIs. And, in terms of Xamarin, there's some things that we did with types for nfloat and nint and things like that to make things work with Apple that are non-standard .NET things. So in .NET 6, we unified our types, which, in the short term, there's definitely some pain. not gonna sugarcoat that, but in the long term, we're gonna see some nice gains and consistency across the whole thing. So very excited that we finally, after years of transition, we're bringing this to full GA fruition here in .NET 6. Well, as part of as Scott Hunter would like to say, the .NET 6 wave. Which I think Wave works really good with the name .NET MAUI.
Ooh, nice.
So,
okay, so the top level, I'm totally not even a .NET developer. I haven't been keeping up. The high level is I can write C# or .NET code, and I can build applications that'll run on Android, iOS, Mac, and Windows. Is that right?
Exactly. And they're native applications. That's a key differentiator. So that means that when your app runs on iOS or Android or Windows or Mac, it's using the same premier UI toolkit that the manufacturers of those OSs say this is the way you should build apps.
Okay. So it's not like because I think that's been as a workaround for a long time. People are building, for instance, like Electron apps or stuff like that, right? Where so it technically will run cross-platform, but it's really running a browser and it's running like it's not that like native, or even going way back like Java or stuff like that, right? But you didn't have this like looks like it's a native application.
Yeah, yeah. You run into what's known as the uncanny valley in some situations, depending on how well that technology is able to mimic the platform. There's certainly other, platforms out there or frameworks out there that do a really good job at it. However, the hybrid thing, which we typically call those as hybrid frameworks, you end up needing to make some compromises in terms of what you can access on the native platform or what kind of UI experiences you can create. But with straight MAUI, you don't have those compromises. Plus, you get to use .NET, so it's one language, right? You don't have to drop into Objective C, Swift, Java, or Kotlin. You could, we're very open to using whatever technologies that you really want to be able to use. But in addition to all of that, we actually do have a really cool hybrid story. So you are a web developer. You've heard of this thing, Blazor?
Yep.
Yeah, a little familiar with that. So what's really interesting to me about this, and it seems to be resonating with some of the early adopters of MAUI, is that you can take a Blazor application or just a Blazor component, and you can drop it into a native MAUI application. And it does run in kind of that hybrid context. However, because that code gets compiled as .NET, because it is .NET C# code, there's really not that same browser interop barrier that you would normally encounter. And again, because some UI frameworks such as Blazor do a really good job with helping you style your UI, you don't end up so much in these uncanny valleys. And you can use it for what it's appropriate for. But then if you really need that native UI experience, MAUI controls are right there in the same application. So you can quickly stand up an application, share your code with web, and sky's the limit. So really cool to see. We've even seen some apps shipping to the app stores already using that Blazor hybrid with MAUI scenario, and it's really cool.
So some of that seems like, you mentioned the word hybrid, and some of it seems like it makes me think of, am I paying like a big performance penalty, or is it like how does it compare to what? I guess part of my question here is, what apps are not a good fit for that hybrid scenario, the Blazor hybrid scenario?
Right. Yeah. So the browsers have gotten really good at executing quickly. So I think that window of what's not a good application is getting narrower and narrower. Whereas a few years back we would have said, well, if you adopt PhoneGap or Cordova or one of those early hybrid frameworks, it would be much better known what's not a really good application for it. So I would think that anything that's heavily graphic intensive may not be good. Anything with heavy animation may not be good. But again, there's going to be exceptions to these rules. So the good news is that if you stand up a MAUI app and you start building in one direction, let's say that you like, hey, I really think I'm going to be able to get away with Blazor and it's going to accomplish all of my needs. And you get a couple miles down the road and that's not working out. You don't have to trash your application. Your .NET code will work just swell without that browser context. And you can stand up native UI in its place without starting your application over again, without starting from scratch. So I think that's a pretty cool way to think about it. Is don't overthink the approach that you take, but also within a Blazor hybrid scenario, you still have access to all the non-UI stuff that a MAUI application provides, such as sensors, file system access, notifications, local notifications, system tray, all the things that you would want to have access to in a native application is all there at your fingertips, even though you might be standing up UI that's HTML and CSS. So, yeah, I don't have specific examples for you. We'll
No,
see what
no.
people do.
Yeah, well, and a lot of it, right, is goes into like you test it and you see what works, and like you're saying, browsers have gotten. We're recording this this
In a
podcast over
browser.
video in a browser now,
Yes.
right? And it's like thinking of doing that years ago would be like that's just ridiculous, and it's like, and now I guess most platforms don't have to spin up a whole browser. There's this like WebView 2 or these native built-in browser controls, right?
Yeah. So WebView 2 is something that we actually use on the desktop. We use it on Windows right now. So when you are building a hybrid application, a Blazor hybrid application with MAUI, you're going to end up with WebView 2 on Windows. On Mac, you're going to use was it WK WebView? And I think that's the same thing on iPhone. So I know that WebView 2 is coming to more platforms. At least I think it is. I don't have any announcements. I'm not announcing anything, but I'm pretty sure that's out there. So, yeah, they're super performant. You can bundle it with your application. It can be acquired separate from your application, depending on what the OS allows for. So there's a lot of things you can do with the browser these days. And even on mobile contexts, they can run super, super well.
So a lot of what I think of mentally, like I still am in this, .NET MAUI, and I'm feeling. I initially think of mobile apps, but I have to like reset my brain because going way back when .NET first shipped, and it's like cool, I can build, what WinForm applications, and then people are like, can I run it on Mac? Well, and it's like, yeah, they're with Mono sort of, but not
Yeah.
really, and so like it. Can I really build like a full featured like desktop application in .NET and it runs
Mhm.
on Windows and then I can ship it and it runs on a Mac too?
Believe it or not. Yeah. No, so we have done several things that are different than Xamarin to enable those, desktop scenarios that differ from mobile. Um, so one of those is multi-window. So you can have multi-window applications when you want to. We are working with several customers that I cannot name, but really cool customers to build out new desktop application experiences. And their requirements are pretty demanding in terms of performance, in terms of multi-window, custom MDI implementations. MDI is multi-document interface, something
Oh
I
yeah.
didn't learn until we started doing MAUI and realized that we needed to do desktop things. So I needed to
Yeah.
learn what is a desktop thing,
Yeah.
and so that's essentially MDI is the kind of thing you would experience in Visual Studio, where you can dock and undock panels, and you can have things all floating around inside of your primary window. So then mouse gestures and pointers, and not pointers like sciencey pointers, but your cursor. Um, I want that to be a finger. I want that to be a hand or whatever. So all of these things are new in Maui. And that's not to say that we've got everything immediately at GA that you could ever imagine for a desktop application, but that's where our vendor partners that build awesome components step up. And because Sync Fusion, Telerik, DevExpress, I can go on and on. They have desktop components and widgets, and they can adapt them for Maui, and they're doing just that, or they're building new controls. So so far we have not hit a limit or a blocker in terms of what we can do for desktop. What I think is really cool is, I mean, I don't know, years ago, and you're given that you've got web developer experience, you remember the whole mobile first design
Yeah.
kind of wave that happened there, and it kind of swept the world. It's like, okay, when you're going to build an application that's going to run multiple places, start with your smallest screen
Yeah.
and build out from there. Whether or
That
not,
was actually my next question is like,
oh
how
yeah,
do I design an app that runs well on a phone and a huge desktop, right?
Well, I mean, the good news is because Xamarin has always been, and now Maui, of course, inherits, it adapts to different screen sizes and resolutions. So all from one project, you can have one set of images and SVGs and raw assets, and then you stand up your layout with the appropriate constraints, and it will adapt to whatever screen you put it on. And then we've got a whole host of solutions for, markup extensions so that you can do on platform for, hey, if it's running on Android, do this one thing, or adaptive triggers, which is akin to media queries, right, in
Okay.
CSS. So essentially, if the screen gets to be larger than 1200 pixels, add another column to the layout, or if it gets below that, remove that right-hand column because I don't have room for it anymore. That kind of stuff, super easy to do with .NET MAUI. Or idioms, like, hey, if I'm running in a desktop context, use a menu bar. If I'm not running in a desktop context, do a flyout menu, or however you decide to design your application. So tons of options. Pretty much you can do anything you need to. And if those things, start to make your UI super muddy, you can always say, hey, if I'm running on desktop, use this desktop specific layout. It's a separate XAML file or whatever. And then, if I'm running on mobile, I've got a separate iPhone or mobile layout. So tons of ways you can do it. Plus, we support multi-targeting. I could go on and on.
Well, tell me about multi-targeting.
Yeah. So with .NET multi-targeting, and this has kind of been supported. Claire Novotny wrote a library. I don't even remember what exactly it was called. Was it SDK Mobile Tools or SDK? I don't know.
Yes.
But it was a way in which you could use this underlying multi-targeting functionality in .NET, where with some conventions, you could say, hey, I want this file to work on this platform, and I want this file to work on this platform. And they're basically sharing an interface, or they're sharing the same class, or they're partials. And so it allows you to do these multi-platform things from a single project. Typically, prior to that, you would end up writing all your Android code, for example, in an Android specific project. And then you'd have a separate project for all your other platform stuff. And, this is just a nice way to bring it all into one project, because as developers, we're focused on our app. We really don't want to be thinking about, as cross-platform developers, we don't want to be thinking about each individual platform. Like, the more I have to worry about four different platforms, the less I can focus on the value of my one application. So that's what we're able to do now. We've kind of taken everything that Claire and that library supported, and we've worked closely with the project system teams and all the other stakeholders within Microsoft to say, hey, let's bring this up to snuff for what we want to do in Maui. So now in Maui, you can do all those things. You can have all your code all in one place, no matter which platforms it needs to compile for. You can use conditional compiler arguments. You can use file name conventions. You can use folder conventions, and the build system will pick up the right things and do all the right things. So your Android code runs on Android only. Your iOS runs on iOS only. And it works in Visual Studio, and they're adding support for it in Visual Studio for Mac too. So that when you're looking at a file, for example, you can go up to the top of that file and say, okay, show me what this looks like for Android. Show me what this looks like for iOS. And it changes your code to show you this is what's going to run when you're on that platform, and this is what's not going to run, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very powerful, very cool.
So let's say I'm developing, like right now, I'm doing this podcast on Windows. I have my laptops, a Mac. Like, do I need to, if I'm developing across all these different platforms, do I need to be jumping around and testing and running on each, or what's the, like, obviously it's important to test on the actual platform you're shipping for, but I don't want to be doing that all day long. So how, what does that experience feel like? Is there anything we do to make it easier so that I'm not having to run around to 19 different devices and test everything all the time?
Right. So on Windows, the story is really cool because you, of course, can be building for Windows. And actually, when you start up a new MAUI application, Windows is the default target these days. This is a change we just made. Previously, it had been Android. And so that makes for a really, there's two reasons we did it. One, it's the faster build cycle, so you can be more productive. And two, it has the least requirements in terms of setting up a bunch of other junk.
Yeah.
So you immediately get Windows out of the box.
I just have to say, when I've like been like, okay, today's the day, I'm going to be a Xamarin developer, and I would get started, and it's like I would get sucked down into Android developer tool hell a little bit. Like, it's fine. I know I've got to get there eventually, but I don't want my first 2 or 3 hours to be spent like messing with Android builds, right? So that actually sounds,
yeah. So there's still more work coming to kind of smooth out the whole Android side of the setup process, because it is quite a few steps. But yeah.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you here too, but there is this Android subsystem for Windows sort of thing too. Is that part of that story, or
so?
Like, I know you can do it manually, but is that going to be like part of the actual main flow in the future?
So it is not part of the main flow right now. It is something that we think would be really cool to add to the main flow in the near future. And we're talking, and we have had conversations with the team that kind of owns that to say, hey, what can we do to make this a better developer experience? Related to it, I happen to have seen an extension for Visual Studio that hopefully will be available in the next couple of weeks. Not an official one, it's a community one. But essentially, it will help you to very quickly get your Windows subsystem for Android started and added to Visual Studio as a device target. Because you have to go through a bunch of steps right now to get it to work, right? You have to go first of all, install it. Then you have to figure out how to get it started. And then you have to go figure out what your IP address is. And then you need the magical incantation from ADB, a specialized Android command line only tool, to connect that. Then it'll show up in Visual Studio. So this extension for Visual Studio will do all of that for you. So, nice. You combine that with Android mobile and tablets. Then you also have the Windows, which is your default. But then you add on to that, we have this iOS hot restart feature, which enables you to take your iPhone with a little cable that you probably bought it with, and you plug that puppy into your computer, your Windows machine, and it becomes a target directly from Windows. Just all you need is the iOS device and your Windows machine, and we guide you through the process of making the connection, and you can start debugging right from there. So really, from Windows, the only target you cannot actually interact with, you can build, but you can't interact with, would be a Mac desktop application, because we can't emulate that at this time.
Right. Okay.
And then the additional scenario, which is also super useful from Windows, is the iOS remote build host or the Mac remote build host. So this is if you do have a Mac, you can have it off to the side, lid closed if you prefer. And you can connect to it from Windows, and it will actually show you your simulator directly on your Windows UI. And we actually, in the upcoming Visual Studio release, have that represented in the Visual Studio UI as part of our XAML Live preview. And what's super cool about that is we're adding the ability for you to actually inspect the UI of your running application, and that will navigate to code for you. And just really, this is what a lot of us have been waiting for. Just tying all that tooling right back to the running application. Because like XAML hot reload's great, but then what if you want to go to the UI and be like, okay, I see it on my screen. Where is that code? Where's that coming from? Right. And with this functionality, you can poke at it with your cursor in Visual Studio, and that will navigate to your code, and then you can go make your changes. So you don't have to have a billion devices.
Okay, so that is really good, and that's the development experience. What about the like testing, like CI kind of thing? What do you recommend for that?
Yeah, so in terms of what we recommend, really doing on-device unit tests is the biggest bang for the buck. There's also the ability to do on-device UI testing. However, that tends to be quite costly and sometimes flaky. So the return on investment there is not awesome. So the more unit tests that you can be writing and then getting them to run on devices, you'll see good results there. With some of the App Center and Xamarin UI test things, which some of those libraries still need to be brought up to .NET 6. But then you also have other open source frameworks like Appium. You can utilize some of those even on your local machine. But with that coolness comes complexity. So really, unit tests are the way to go. And if you need to run across a breadth of devices, then the App Center Test Cloud is available if you're willing to pay the pretty penny. But they have tons of different devices, and we utilize that ourselves to run tests against MAUI and our control gallery and all the tests that we have. But we've kind of shied away from doing UI tests these days and more towards doing on-device unit tests.
Okay. So what's the let's say I'm sold now. I want to get into this. Assuming this comes out right after, or after the announcement at Build, so what do I actually need to do in order to get started building MAUI apps now?
Yeah, so the best way to get started is to download the Visual Studio Preview that will be available at Build. The preview channel of Visual Studio will carry the GA bits of .NET MAUI, and it will give you everything you need for Android, iOS, Mac, and Windows right there. And so with that simple install, check the .NET MAUI box at the install. You can start developing right there. It's file new, MAUI application, and you're off to the races.
Okay. So, going way back, we talked about like open source background and Xamarin being open source and stuff like that. If I'm not using Visual Studio, am I still able to get the bits, open source and do a little more work to get things set up?
So with Xamarin, that would have been a hard no. But the cool thing is that because we're now part of .NET, you can install MAUI directly from the command line using .NET itself. So we are what's called an optional workload in .NET. So we are part of .NET, but we're also, because we are gigabytes of things, we don't want to force that upon everybody that just wants to install .NET. So you can install .NET with the installer from the .NET website, and then you can go .NET workload install MAUI. And .NET workload install MAUI will go ahead and grab all the things that you need to be able to build and run from the command line. And then you could use Visual Studio Code. You could use another editor of your preference. They will all have differing support for C#, for XAML, so you'll have to decide, are those things worth it? You're definitely going to get the best experience in terms of hot reload, .NET hot reload, which also works with MAUI. Blazor hot reload. I don't know if that's actually the term we use for it, but the hot reload that works with the Blazor and the CSS things.
Yeah, pretty sure that's hot reload too there.
Yeah. I think that will work in some scenarios outside of Visual Studio with like the .NET, what is it, .NET Watch or whatever that works for those scenarios, but that does not work at this point for MAUI scenarios.
Okay. And I always have to remind myself and think through this. So there's hot restart, which is detects code has changed and restarts the application. And that's okay, but I lose my state. I have to wait while the app kind of restarts. I have to get back to where I was. And what's crazy about hot reload is it actually updates just the code and injects it in, right? And I don't have to restart my application. I don't have to click through the app to get where I was. It's just updates.
Yeah. So it reapplies that code and then reapplies the state that it replaced. So yeah, you don't lose your navigation. You don't lose your view state. It's super powerful. And I think that .NET Hot Reload, which does a method body replacement essentially. So And I've had really a lot of fun with that over the past week, building out samples and changing code. And very rarely do I have to restart my application. Hopefully in the future, I'll never have to restart my application. I can just keep coding. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do with it. And the hot restart, the way you described it is definitely accurate. The additional nuance to it is when we talk about iOS hot restart, we're essentially taking that same concept but applying it to the ability to plug your iOS device into your Windows machine. So we can take that same hot restart concept further. We actually use it under the hood on Android development for fast deploy. And we could use it on other platforms as well to tighten up the developer loop so that you have to do less restarting of your application.
Okay, cool.
Less rebuilding of your application. That's the way I should
Yeah,
say.
yeah. And that, like you said, that cycle of like building and like it's got to be compiled for that platform and it's got to be shipped over the, and
Man, but we
installed and
developed applications like that for decades,
right.
like, but now, like if I get up in the morning and start to build an application and my hot reload doesn't work, it's like, scrap it. I'm not working today.
Yeah.
It's
That's
like
it.
we've become spoiled.
Okay. So I've just got a few more questions. One is, so the obvious kind of like selling point for me is I'm a .NET developer. I can use my C# skills. I can use my familiar tools. I can use my libraries. I can use code I've written and all that, NuGet packages. That's the main selling point for me. Is that really like if I'm talking to other developers about like, hey, Maui's awesome, is that kind of the main thing, or are there other like things that, because there are, like you mentioned, there are other things that we talked about, Electron, there's like Flutter, there's some other options. So like, how is there anything else I should think of beyond it's .NET?
Yeah. So it is .NET. I think one of the other major selling points is you can stay within one language. You don't have to go out into Objective-C and Swift. I know that one of the reasons that a lot of developers love Blazor is the hatred of JavaScript. Or you just don't feel comfortable with it, or you just don't know it.
I gotta say that, because like I think people get allergic to like, I hate, like you're a web developer, you should know JavaScript. It's like, I can do JavaScript. I can write JavaScript. It's not going to be the best JavaScript. It's not going to take advantage of all of, it's like, so like in cases where I'm writing business logic, I think I'd do better in C# with that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I on a personal level, I started out as a web developer. So ASP and Access databases, and then graduated to SQL servers. And,
Nice. Yep.
I started way back, man. So, yeah, I have a lot of appreciation for all kinds of different languages, whether it was VB, VB script, VB.NET, C#, I certainly love and I advocate for. But yeah, so, being able to maximize the languages that you know and have mastered, I think is awesome. One of the other great things that you get from Maui is accessibility. So accessibility is something that is it's a pretty hard to understand and get up to speed on topic. We realize the importance of it as developers many times, but we don't know what to do about it. So the great thing about Maui is, because first of all, it uses native UI controls, you get the native platform accessibility features by default. But also on top of that, we've added semantic services that enable you to more directly control your accessibility experiences, whether it's auditory, visual, etc. So that's something that's a pretty cool advantage. And then because we are also using native UI, if there are other native libraries out there, you can bring them to .NET. So we have a couple of different patterns for doing that. So let's say that you had a CocoaPod or you have a Java library out there and it's super popular in the ecosystem, and we don't have a comparable offering for it in .NET. You can totally use it. You can use it either just by invoking it from .NET, or you can write a binding around it, whether it's a small API that you surface or it's a full API that you surface. Like, for example, I was looking on Twitter and there's a library called Lottie. Are you familiar with Lottie?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Cool animations, right?
Yeah.
And so this library is been out there for a long time with a binding for Xamarin, but nobody has done any updates to it for .NET 6. And so this one developer says, "Hey, well, I just did what's known as a slim binding, which essentially is I just need to be able to call this one method and use this library." And so you create the wrapper around that with .NET, you invoke into the native code, and you're up and running with a Java library essentially. Or if it's on the Apple side, it's probably a Swift or an Objective-C library. So you have that capability as well, and you can stay in .NET, but use not just what you get on NuGet, but you get all the other stuff too.
Oh, very cool.
So
Okay,
I could
one last
think of
question.
more if you gave me more time.
Yeah, I know. I partly why I set this up is relatively short because I'm like, this could go forever, right? There's so much cool stuff to talk about. One last question is, can you kind of summarize where we're at today, like May 2022? What's shipping today? What's in the future? Where are we going?
So, as we kind of started off at the top, this is a huge transition in the .NET ecosystem. It's a unification of this Xamarin technology and all the things, the build systems and everything with .NET itself. So we recognize this is also a major transition for the ecosystem. So we're shipping a GA SDK here at Build. And that's going to give you the ability to build Android, iOS, macOS, and Windows applications. We have seen since we did RC just a few weeks ago, a lot of libraries updating and starting to ship. So the ecosystem is starting to make that transition. And we anticipate that we're going to see several months, if not a long tail of that, as libraries are like, oh, I really need this. I really need that. And they start bringing their stuff and recompiling with .NET targets, .NET 6 targets in mind. And so, we're encouraging developers right now, bring your libraries to .NET MAUI and .NET 6. Now is the time. We're ready for it. You've got a GA product. You can depend upon it. Microsoft supports it. We have a very public support policy, so you can depend upon it. You know who to call if you've got a problem. And it's going to be around for a really long time. And then as we get later in the year, as tooling becomes stable, because we're going to ship previews of tooling with the GA SDK, when tooling becomes stable and we know that we can depend on being more productive a little bit later in the year, then we'll encourage more Xamarin applications to migrate, and we'll go broader, right, with the call for, hey, come be productive building your awesome apps with .NET. But the first phase really is let's energize the ecosystem to start making this transition. Some people were just waiting to know, is this a real product that we can take a bet on?
Yeah.
Which is a realistic thing.
And when Microsoft ships something as GA, like you said, that comes with a support policy. And Microsoft's kind of famous / infamous for supporting things for a very long time, right?
Yes.
So it's like once it's shipped, like that's a commitment for Microsoft and something as a customer. You're like, okay, it's actually a real thing now.
Yeah, and .NET, we just celebrated 20 years out in the world.
Yeah.
So we've got ourselves a young adult, and Xamarin, like I mentioned, has pedigree that goes back like at least 12 years to some early mono days. So while MAUI is a brand new first GA, it's also an evolution of a product that has been around for quite a while. And so the commitment is there. There is definitely proof in the pudding that this works. Like Xamarin Forms, it survived 7 releases of Android, 7 releases of iOS. It went from round beveled edges and gradients and whatever that design pattern was called, where things were like leathery and stuff.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
And then it went minimal design and simple and flat.
Yeah.
And then there's like, neomorphic skewism, blah, blah, blah. And so the great thing is if you had built your application at the very beginning, you wouldn't have to have, been forced to rewrite it that whole time, because Xamarin Forms prove that as a pattern, as a technology, it can do that. for both, line of business enterprise applications, as well as, we've got customers doing commercial e-commerce, straight to consumer stuff, and games. People build games with it, so tons of stuff you can do with it. So yeah, it's a GA product. You can take a bet on it. There's a support person you can call, and they can help you with your stuff. It's pretty awesome.
All right. I think you just committed to helping me with all my problems.
I'm
Awesome.
passing along commitments from people with more power than me.
Where do we so where do you go to get started then with MAUI? You said download the preview.
Yeah. So visualstudio.com preview will have the bits you can install. We actually have our own website. I should probably direct everybody to our website. So .net/MAUI. That'll get you to our MAUI landing page. I think we might be taking over the .NET web page come GA. I don't know.
Hey, why not?
I saw a beautiful design. Myra showed me a cool design. I was like, oh, that looks really nice.
Cool.
So okay. From there you can get all the activation tutorial, and it'll walk you through installing everything. Of course, I'll have a blog post out that'll give you all the dirty details as well.
Cool. I'll get that all linked in the show notes. So. All right. I'm out of questions. I'm ready to wrap up. You got anything else you want to say?
Hey, man, thanks for having me on. It's the first time I've done a podcast with you. I hope it won't necessarily be the last, but
absolutely
I appreciate
not.
You having me.
Cool. All right. Thanks a bunch, David.